what it means is that the unthinkable until now is thinkable. And that is, in this particular circumstance, a kinetic industrial scale war waged in Europe in 2022. And there's been a sort of a complacent, denialist sort of approach that most of us have had for years, that industrial scale warfare by one country visited upon its neighbour was somehow left in the last century, that warfare in the 21st, 22nd century would all be about grey zone warfare. It would be cyber, it would be basically warfare that would not trouble citizens going about their daily lives. What we now see is a country in Europe whose citizens are flooding into the subways in search of shelter from incoming missiles and bombs. We see people getting into their cars and jamming the highways to try to leave the capital city of a European country. So if it can happen in Europe today, then I suppose the larger meaning of that particularity, Bev, is that if it can happen in Europe today, why can it not happen in Asia or Oceania, let's be more specific, Australia, tomorrow?
And to that point, despite strong condemnation, warnings from the West all along, the reality is there will be no actual physical support for Ukraine.
No. The closest thing to physical support has been countries sending arms to Ukraine, to arm Ukraine, but not to defend Ukraine. Nobody is stepping in to put themselves in harm's way to protect Ukraine against Russian troops. Now, in one sense, that's completely understandable and normal because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It doesn't have a security treaty with anybody else. It surrendered its nuclear weapons in 1994 in return for a guarantee from Russia that Russia would respect its sovereignty, and Russia had 3 years earlier recognized Ukraine's sovereignty. So it didn't. I guess it didn't feel threatened, and it has no formal alliances with anybody else. And although it had signalled an interest in applying to join NATO, it's not a member of NATO. But on the other hand, it's shocking to see a great nuclear-armed power. Really, Russia is still, despite being, I think it's number 11, ranked in the list of world's biggest economies, it's still in the top 3 countries in terms of military prowess, just walking into the neighbouring country unopposed and smashing as it pleases. And the US, which of course has led the political and economic resistance, is not going to wage any kinetic resistance. And, a democracy of 44 million people on the edge of Europe is easy prey. And there you go. So obviously the sanctions have not discouraged Putin. But it shouldn't really be a surprise, on the other hand, Bev, because this is the 3rd time Putin has attacked Ukraine, twice in 2014. This is the 3rd time. There were sanctions applied by the Western world on him in 2014, and of course they've deterred him not one whit.
So let's come to our region, and of course we know that China has already said that sanctions shouldn't be applied. They've given Russia their tacit support in this. Is it something that they are watching? Could they be emboldened themselves?
Well, China has always liked to hold high rhetorically the sanctity of international borders and the principle of non-interference in other countries' affairs. Of course, until it has suited China to press its territorial disputes with its neighbours. In this case, China, in the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson overnight, was making the case that it was actually the US and the West who caused this confrontation by flooding Ukraine with offensive weaponry and armory. That's the Chinese argument. And the most, I suppose, advanced rhetoric you get from China is to say that all sides must show restraint. Well, it's difficult to see how Ukraine can show restraint when it's being invaded by a larger neighbour. So that's the rhetorical and participatory end of the Chinese with the Ukraine part of the story. But the larger principle here is the question of a strong dictatorial state invading a democratic neighbour. And what we saw just in the last 24 hours from Taiwan, the president of Taiwan, of course, the small self-ruled democratic island that is claimed by China as part of its own, we saw Tsai Ing-wen tell her military to step up its level of military alert against any possible intrusions from Beijing. So the Tsai Ing-wen, at least, president of Taiwan, sees a very direct connection between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and possible Chinese military action against Taiwan. And in both cases, I would suggest to you, Bev, that quite apart from the territorial and any material gain that might be involved for those two countries, China and Russia, they are both countries that are threatened. They feel their legitimacy is threatened by successful democratic states operating in their neighborhood. And Taiwan, of course, being the only fully ethnically Chinese, functional, successful, prosperous, and quite successful democracy.
So what does it mean more broadly, Peter? I mean, we don't know how long this conflict might last in Ukraine, how well they'll be able to stand up to this Russian invasion. But how destabilising is it going to be?
Well, the Albanian representative to the United Nations said today, "Who's next?" That was his comment, and that question still hangs, and we don't know the answer. So, obviously, the NATO states now fear exposed, because to take Ukraine takes Russia right up to the border of Poland. And right up onto the border of NATO states. So the US, even Canada, is sending more troops and equipment to defend NATO borders against possible further acts of Russian aggression. So I'm assuming, of course I don't know, but I'm assuming, Bev, that we'll see Putin take some time to consolidate and digest his control over Ukraine before thinking further afield. But why wouldn't he think further afield? He seized an annexed part of Georgia in 2008. He's gotten away with that. He's had 3 bites now at Ukraine, and so far he's gotten away with all of those. That would seem to me to suggest that he thinks he's onto a good thing.
Disturbing times, Peter. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Sure, happy to, Bev.